Welcome to Sarat Samvad Emerging Scholar Series, an initiative from Border Studies in South Asia. Our guest for today is Ms. Ria Sinha. She is a research associate foreign policy and security at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, previously the Brookings, India. Ms. Sinha has made a significant contribution to regional integration in South Asia, particularly in areas of connectivity, cross-border trade, and building supply chains. She has written for national dailies and online portals such as The Hindu, The Pioneer, and The Print. Ms. Sinha, thank you for giving us this time. And our first question to you is: comparably, South Asia is the least integrated region around the world. What do you think are the issues that are impeding the regional connectivity among the South Asian countries?
Firstly, Ashu, thank you for having me on Sarhad Sambad. I think it's a wonderful and a very timely initiative to encourage discussion about borders. It's an area that is, either viewed through a security prism or has been limited in scope so far. So my best wishes to you for taking this initiative forward. Coming back to your question, South Asia is, of course, for years we've heard that South Asia is the least integrated region in the world. A World Bank report quantifies that regional integration in South Asia is approximately 5%, which is very low when compared to East Asia, the ASEAN countries at 22%, or the European Union at more than 60%. If we broaden the definition of South Asia from, including the neighboring countries, including Myanmar, even then the regional integration comes up only to 5.6%. There have been a number of reasons why regional integration has been low, and we'll come to that. But in the last 2 decades, China has been able to leverage this lack of integration and establish itself as a major trade partner in the region. It's become the top trading partner of Bangladesh and Pakistan, and it has strengthened trade and investment with Nepal, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. Therefore, I think your question is important, and it is important for us to reflect on the issues that have continued to contribute to regional disconnectivity over the years. One of the pressing issues in the region is, of course, the India-Pakistan relations. Most of the issues of disconnectivity in the region stem from the conflicting nature of India-Pakistan relations. Several initiatives of SAARC have been held hostage. For example, the SAARC motor vehicles agreement could not go forward. For example, the SAARC satellite, which eventually had to be renamed the South Asia satellite. SAFTA is not fully operational yet, and we are far from having a SAARC visa in the region. These examples reflect the gravity of the conflicting nature of India-Pakistan relations in the region. Another reason is the trust deficit between the countries in the region. Given the geographic asymmetry between the countries, India is usually perceived as a big brother in South Asia, which has led to concerns about India asserting its dominance in the region. Talking about when we talk about regional economic disintegration, for that matter, I think the role of non-tariff barriers is very important. Despite the existence of multiple bilateral and regional trade agreements, economic integration has been low. SAFTA came into the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, came into force in 2006. India has a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka signed in 1998. Despite this, the regional trade has not taken off. Regional integration has not taken off. This explains that agreements by themselves are not enough unless barriers to trade are holistically addressed. Non-tariff barriers such as para-tariff, high logistics costs, they have significantly increased the cost of trade in South Asia. In fact, it's funny that right now it's much cheaper to send goods from New Delhi to Singapore than from New Delhi to Bangladesh. Another reason is that, another reason why this trade or in regional economic integration is not picking up is because of the competitive nature of products in the region. Most of the countries in South Asia are competing in a narrow range of export products, usually consisting of textile and clothing, and they have a very similar import profile, namely petroleum products. As a result, they're less reliant on intra-regional trade and more reliant on trade with extra-regional partners. The last point here I'd like to make is that poor infrastructure at our borders is again a contributor to this dismal level of regional integration. The infrastructure at our borders is quite inferior, and many issues are faced at the ground level in moving goods and increasing people-to-people connectivity. For the land custom station and integrated checkposts at our borders, they lack adequate parking facilities and warehousing spaces. There's a lack of testing facilities at the trade centers, adding to the time and cost of trade. So while these issues, largely persist, I would say in the last few years, there have also been efforts to improve connectivity and find alternate ways to navigate issues faced in with neighboring countries. For example, in September 2019, India and Nepal inaugurated a 69-kilometer long petroleum pipeline from Barauni in Bihar to Amlekganj in Nepal. It's the first of its kind petroleum pipeline in South Asia, and it navigates the issue of congestion at the borders. It eases the process of transportation. And petroleum is one of Nepal. Petroleum products are one of Nepal's major imports from India. Another example is very recently, on September 5th this year, the inland waterway between Tripura and Bangladesh was made operational to facilitate trade. This was the first time since independence that goods on a vessel reached Tripura. Having said this, it's also, having highlighted these issues, having said this, it's also important to reflect that the dynamics of the region are changing. It's very important to remember that China has made significant inroads in the region in trade and investment. India, whether it's a result of increasing Chinese presence or different focus of foreign policy, has been focused on neighborhood first and acting east to increase connectivity within the region and expand it to the Indo-Pacific. So while we speak about SAARC as a large institutional body, most of the recent regional initiatives go beyond SAARC to include all our neighbors. Just yesterday, the Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla was in Myanmar, and he concluded a very important coastal shipping agreement to strengthen security ties between both countries. So while the issue of regional integration persists, the only way it can be overcome is a very strong political will to enhance integration. COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of geography, and this is an opportune moment for the region to rethink its supply chains and take steps to facilitate integration.
Thank you, Ria. That was a very intriguing answer. As you talk about the Nepal and India's bilateral projects, in your recent work, you highlighted the relevance of India's connectivity infrastructure in Nepal for strengthening bilateral cooperation and economic engagement across the border. In contrast, you also delineate challenges that comes in a way while completing or undertaking several infrastructure projects, especially relating to land acquisitions and railway projects connecting borderlands. What are these challenges and how do you suggest overcoming it?
So like I mentioned in my previous answer, that the dismal state of regional connectivity in South Asia has its roots in lack of quality infrastructure. Enhancing regional connectivity is one of the top policy priority infrastructure, build quality infrastructure. Most of the government's economic assistance to the neighborhood goes in the infrastructure sector, whether it is building of roads, railways, ports, pipelines, etc. In fact, between 2014 and 18, the amount spent on infrastructure building was approximately rupees 10,000 crores. These projects are important. They not only facilitate economic growth for both countries, both the donor and the beneficiary country, but also accelerate regional integration. Since we're talking of Nepal, particularly in the last few years, approximately 73% of the total budget outlay, the total money earmarked for Nepal development assistance, has gone for infrastructure projects. A major chunk of this has gone to the Terai Road project, which is these parallel roads running close to the Indian borders. The railway project between Jogbani in India, Biratnagar in Nepal, and Jayanagar and Bartibas railway project, development of integrated checkposts, etc. So while India, so much money is going into these projects and developing these projects, and India has been investing so much, but there have been implementation gaps. And this gap is mostly a result of lack of capacity and coordination between the donor and the beneficiary countries. There have been, some projects have gone on for more than 10 years, more than 10, 15 years. And this long-term delay in project implementation is adding to the cost of the project as well as India's reputation as a donor. In the particular study, we highlight land acquisition as a major issue of implementation of projects, not just by India, but many multilateral countries also, many other foreign donors, such as the Department of International Development of the UK government or the Asian Development Bank. They also highlight land acquisition as a major issue in implementation of the projects. In fact, a project is considered very high risk by these international donors if there is a large scale land acquisition required. Despite this, we realize that the subject has not been studied before, and land acquisition has often been used as a tool to speed up or slow down the project completion based on political will and priority of the governments. Because such land acquisition difficulties persist, there are many, we talk about lack of investment. There are so many public sector enterprises that want to venture into the neighboring countries but haven't been able to do so because it's very difficult to sustain in such an environment. My co-author, Dr. Constantino Xavier, and I, we visited Nepal. We undertook a field study, and we realized that there's an archaic legal framework regulating the land and property rights in Nepal, including compensation and resettlement process, which has proven to be a major hurdle. On the donor side, on the Indian side, conversely, the major problem has been an archaic development cooperation system. It lacks technical clauses, it lacks an expert assessment, and there are no standards to mitigate the risks that come as a result of land acquisition. So in this particular study, we demonstrate this by taking up two case studies. First, we chose the Postal Road Hulaki Rajmarg project in Nepal. It's a highway which runs east to west in Nepal, which is it's very close to the Indian border. It runs parallel to the Indian border of Nepal, to the India's border with Nepal. The second case study we chose was the Jogbani Biratnagar railway link. They were chosen because they highlight different issues pertaining to land acquisition in Nepal. For example, the Hulaki Rajmarg or the Postal Road project highlighted the issues in the donor country not preparing a correct detailed project report before initiation of project construction. In this case, the detailed project report between 2006 and 10 was prepared by an Indian consultant, which did not have knowledge of the local Nepali terrain. As a result, there were issues in land alignment which could not be, as a result of which the contractors faced difficulties on the ground. In 2 years since the first MOU was signed in 2010, only 10% of the road was completed. Of course, the Indian government realized that there were issues, the project was not moving forward. It was one of the, like I mentioned before, most of India's investment was going into development cooperation, money was going into this project. So because of this, the mistake was realized, and in 2006, the MOU was revised, where it said that 90% Nepali government must make 90% of the land available before the construction of the road. However, when we went to the ground, we saw what challenges were. We went at 2-3 locations of this construction was taking place, and we saw that there was still, the land acquisition process was still not complete. We went earlier this year in February 2020. Both Indian and Nepali contractors were working together in completion of this. At some stretches, the highway was just 7 meters wide, and in other stretches it was 15 or 14 meters wide. So there was an uneven alignment of the land throughout, and there were encumbrances on the road which the Nepali government failed to clear. There were electric poles in the middle of the road, whereas the Indian government had asked for encumbrance-free land. So these are the issues of coordination and sort of and the lack of sort of jointly addressing a certain problem when it comes to implementing projects. On the contrary, the rail project, the Jogbani Biratnagar rail project, it highlights Nepal's internal problems with land acquisition. Now, Nepal is a newly federal country. They're still placing the laws in place. As a result, there is a lot of issues on pertaining to property rights in the country. The issues with we witnessed that there were issues with compensation, that people with adjacent land were compensated differently. We saw issues related to rehabilitation. There were issues related to just not having a transparent mechanism in the compensation determination committee. The project affected families were not were not represented in these committees, and it was a very opaque process that was taking place. These are some of Nepal's internal problems with its property rights framework. Based on identifying these challenges, highlighting them, we made several suggestions in our paper. We suggested that first of all, a detailed project report, whenever it's prepared for a project, must have a joint venture of the donor country and the beneficiary country, so that before the start of project construction, you have the technical specifications in place. We also highlighted that there's a need for comparative assessment of best practices adopted by other donors and multilaterals. We made a comparative study also. There's a section on that where we saw that, you know, land acquisition is of course a problem. It's the same problem for India as it is for an ADB project. But the way it's addressed in Nepal is very different for an ADB project as compared to an Indian project. For an ADB project, the government of Nepal, the Department of Roads, actually set up a division of the Asian Development Bank to coordinate for the projects. I think there has to be an adoption of best practices from these multilaterals so that we are able to complete our projects in a timely and cost-efficient manner. Then again, Nepal needs to strengthen its property rights framework. It needs to encourage digitization of land records and ensure that the compensation process is transparent. That said, India will also have to be cautious. I mean, of course, it's all good when written on paper, but India will also have to be cautious not to interfere in the internal matters of Nepal. And it rather needs to have like a bilateral or periodic review mechanism. So far, what we've seen that MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, which is a nodal agency for coordinating for these development projects, has had a hands-off approach to land acquisition. You know, globally, as more agencies look at land rights, they look at property rights in a more serious manner and see it as a high-risk project. The Indian government also needs to realize that land needs to be brought at the center of development policy discussions.
Thank you. Moving on, you have worked extensively on cross-LOC trade that exists between India and Pakistan. Can you share the insights from your research work with us?
Surely. So the cross-LOC trade is a very interesting case studies on how you can make different kinds of borders work. Different kinds of border works for the benefit of people living in the border areas. Before I jump onto the cross-LOC trade itself, I want to speak a bit about confidence building measures and put it into context why cross-LOC trade was so important. I speak of cross-LOC trade in the past tense because the trade was suspended in April last year over some allegations that I will come to later in due course. But we need to first understand what these confidence building measures are and what their role is. They're tools for mitigating, they're tools for managing and resolving a conflict. They're very dynamic in nature. The nature of confidence building measures change as the process of conflict changes. And they're often used when hard power is known to cause more harm than bring peace. So between India and Pakistan since 1947, there have been 29 confidence building measures. And this is where the importance of cross-LOC trade comes in, because it was the longest running confidence building measure between the two countries. It was the most successful despite years of political hiccups between the two countries. Cross-LOC trade was never suspended in the decades of its functionality. This mobility, the most important part of this is to view it in the context of what this LOC means. It was a closed area, it was a closed periphery for a very long time. However, mobility was allowed across the line of control, first in 2005 in the form of cross-LOC travel, and then in 2008 in the form of cross-LOC trade. The trade started on 21st October 2008, and from literally struggling to send the first set of consignment, the first truck across the line of control. I mean, I remember seeing pictures of it, and it was no more than a tempo that was sent across because they were struggling to find goods to send across. The trade grew in 10 years. It grew so much that the volume of the volume of good traded amounted to 7,500 crores in the 11 years of its existence. It's very interesting when you see how cross LOC trade was thought of, was thought of how it would work and what it would do. It had a very interesting SOP. So it was supposed to be a barter trade that existed between the divided region of Jammu and Kashmir, where there was no mechanism, where there was no banking mechanism, where there was nothing, but there was no banking mechanism, no communication channel. It was supposed to be a blind trade. And the Ministry of Home Affairs had negotiated the list of items that would be traded. They had established the SOP of cross LOC trade. The list of items was also very intriguing. It was not based on the HS codes, on the harmonic coding system. For example, there were 21 items listed on each side, and the items said fresh fruits and vegetables, right? That could include 1,000 items. It also included embroidered items that could again be, from an item of clothing to a handkerchief to a hat to what have you. So it was quite interesting in that way. And the second interesting part about it was that it was, since both countries, it's a disputed territory, both countries did not want to perceive cross LOC trade as an international trade, because LOC is not an international border. As a result, the imports are called traded in goods and the exports are called traded out goods. This was the parlance that was used for cross LOC trade. My own research over the last few years in cross LOC trade spanned from identifying what challenges of this trade are, how it can be improved, and how the trade can be made more effective in its functioning. I did a lot of field work on it. I went to the trading points in Uri, in Punch, and I spoke to the traders, I spoke to the policymakers on how this trade can be improved, what can be done to increase trade, to strengthen this confidence building measure further. There were a lot of issues that again need to be addressed. There were a lot of accusations on cross LOC traders about Hawala trading, about terror funding, as a result of which it was suspended last year. But what I would like to highlight is that for 11 years, the challenges of this trade were highlighted. For example, I said, the list of items to be exchanged was very vague. It never specified that these items were supposed to be grown in Jammu and Kashmir. So as a result, it was being, the trade was open to a lot of vulnerabilities. It was being used by traders to, it was possibly being used by traders to to send goods from rest of India through the LOC to Pakistan. And and most important to know, it was a duty-free trade, which means there was zero tariffs. So it was also being seen as a mode to just evade customs, if you would. We highlighted various issues with the trade. We said, okay, fine, let's get a harmonic system of coding. Even though it's not an international trade, let's have a coding system where you identify specific products that could be sent. Why don't you identify a banking channel that could be established? In fact, in 2016, the RBI gave a nod for a Nostro-Vostro banking system for cross LOC trade, but it never materialized because Islamabad did not agree to it. We spoke about establishing a communication channel through the trade facilitation centers, so that there is more, there's an increase in communication between both parties, and it does not remain a blind trade. The trade was suspended. It's not closed. We are hoping for its revival because the trade had merits. It revived the local economy of the bordering region. In the first 7 years of its operation, I'm going to give you the statistics. It generated 550,000 manpower work days for an income of 805 crores for a lot of people. A local laborer would earn 1,400 per day from just unloading goods from their trucks. That was the scope of this particular CBM. And if it was not suspended despite a lot of issues between both governments for 10 years, I think there is a scope to strengthen the operating procedure of this particular trade and revive it for the benefit of both LOC East and LOC West.
Thank you for that answer. Moving on to our last question. What are the challenges and growth opportunities you see for border studies emerging within South Asia, especially in context of your experience working with think tanks?
I mean, in my experience, border studies in South Asia has been very limited in its scope so far. There's a scope to further expand border studies, beyond borders being viewed as, from the prism of security, from political anxieties, and just from formal infrastructures that exist. And there's a need to conduct more interdisciplinary research for borders. So far, the number of measures that we have seen at the borders have been centrally controlled and have emanated from these border anxieties. The confidence building measures that I was talking about, the border huts between India and Bangladesh, the integrated check post at the border regions, they're all controlled by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and there's a very little role that the bordering regions themselves play in this. Therefore, I feel that within the think tank community, within the policy making circles, there is a need to look at borders as isolated units capable of expanding and taking a life of their own. There's a vast opportunity to understand the border ecosystem, that people living along the border areas, they interact more with each other than the state capital for running their local economy. Borders are also an important aspect of regional integration in South Asia. If we were to study the relationship, between bordering districts, we would actually say that there's more integration and interdependences between these bordering regions than, the central countries. In fact, in the 19th century, during the colonial era, it was this limited land border trade and the potential that it held, the benefits that it had for the economy, that led to development of roads and railways networks at the border. In fact, we had more connectivity routes with Nepal, even a rail connectivity route with Nepal back then than what we have now. But the good news is, the approach, the government, whether it's the government or the think tanks, the approach has been evolving from a very security-oriented approach with border management to opening up of borders for trade and travel. In Nepal, for example, the MEA established a consulate in Birganj because it realized the importance, because the cross-border projects were so important. The number of infrastructure projects on the border have been increasing as a result of increase in trade and travel. Therefore, it is important that borders need not be looked at buffer zones anymore. They should not be looked at, with the very colonial mindset of remote peripheries of a nation state, which are important for security. They must be seen as facilitators of economic growth, and how the initiation of cross-LOC trade revived commercial activity in Uri. I have seen in Petrapol at the India-Bangladesh border how, as a result of the land custom station and the ICP, there has been an increase in the in the local business around the bordering areas. Therefore, there's immense scope of studying what happens at the borders. There's a scope for studying migration patterns. There's a scope for studying languages spoken, biodiversity, water connectivity. And when we study these areas, we will also realize that we are in fact more connected than how much we can quantify. So borders also have a potential to develop as economic zones of thriving activities. Like I said before, at Petrapol, for example, there are stories of entrepreneurial success. There are restaurants that opened up, there are hotels that opened up because trade and travel was taking place through these borders. And I urge the community, the policy circle, to see that when we use these different metrics to understand connectivity, we will see that regional integration can be viewed differently. How we quantify, how we talk about connectivity can be viewed differently in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria, for the informative answers. It was quite instructive on the future trajectories of border studies in India and also in South Asia. I would also like to thank you for engaging us with this session and providing us with your valuable time and counsel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ashu.